much. It's so nice to see so many faces that are very, very dear. I was saying to Edward a moment ago, and I said this to my wife earlier when talking about the fact that I was going to give this talk. It feels a bit like coming home. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Neil. I started doing work, my master's and doctoral work under Joe Boyden, a friend of many of ours. Now, like longer ago than I would care to admit, but like 20 years, the gray is coming in the beard. When I met many of you, there was no grey, and I was very much sort of like a newer kid on the block, and I'm certainly not anymore. But it's been a while because I spent sort of the first half of my career, which I guess you can call it now, doing work very specifically focused on child protection, child labour, the things that are wrong with it, inspired and working with people like Bill, Michael, Deborah, Olivia, lots of you here. Um, and then in the last, now it is approaching a decade, have kind of been doing like this sort of applied let's trial alternatives bit. And essentially what I'm planning to talk about as rapidly as possible, I know I've only got 20 minutes, going to try and stretch it probably to 23, is talk a little bit about these alternatives. I have a slide deck which I'm about to show you. I should warn you in advance that I will, relatively speaking, whiz through bunches of it because it's too long. And then I should also warn you that the title of said slide deck is different to the title that I gave you lot in the abstract, because what I had suggested I would speak about when first being in touch with Edward was one pilot project and its sort of background and its findings. But the reality is, over the last sort of decade, 7, 8 years, I've been involved in running two parallel pilot projects that, broadly speaking, do exactly the same thing, are motivated by the same logic, and have findings that very much sort of are in synergy. So instead of giving the sort of one rigorous scientific, this is the story of our one pilot, I'm going to kind of give a bit more the meta picture of the two. So I will share my screen now. Tell me if you can see. Play from start. Is
Yep.
that all good?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, now you
All
people
good.
have moved over here. Okay, so the title is Just Give Money to the Poor: Insights from South Asia on the Alternatives to the Politics of Rescue, right? I'm not going to labor the point about the fact that rescue politics are a thing and that they exist and that they are particularly sort of prevalent when it comes to protecting children internationally and to the international development world. I trust that I know from seeing the faces on this screen, I know that for many of you, that's sort of understood and read. I don't know everybody in the network. So just sort of very, very briefly, what I understand to be the Politics of Rescue, these are two books that I wrote or co-wrote about the politics of rescue. Broadly speaking, I think we can understand the politics of rescue in relation to international child protection or within international child protection and in relation to young people as kind of like the DNA of the international development industry, right? Or the international development industry, the institutions that comprise child protection within development have sort of preset assumptions about how children should safely mature, how child development should go, how families should be structured, what labor and life and learning should look like. And broadly speaking, when labor and life and learning doesn't look like that, deviate from the said script, there's a similarly established script for what needs to be done about it, right? So there's a sort of pathologizing of typically non-Western, non-middle class childhoods and maturation pathways, and an intervention sort of portfolio that many of us over many, many years, and in some cases with the great and the good on this screen over decades, have been arguing is often damaging, often heavily inappropriate, sees interventions that are very top down, that are often quite punitive, yada, yada, yada. Let me see. Sorry, I just want to clarify, which of the screens can you see? Can you see the one where the two books are? Can you see the bit that's got my
Yeah, we
notes on
see
it?
the one
One
with the
with
two books now. Yeah.
all right, so I've got two here, so I'm a bit confused. We know Collateral Damage, seminal book published now almost 20 years ago, that, as I say, much of the development world, particularly the sort of child protection world, is top down, it is depoliticized, and it's often very ineffective. Young people in particular, but this can be very much applied to the rescuing of sex workers, for example, are often abstracted from their social context, and therefore interventions tend to sort of act on them rather than with them or through them. And critically, again, as many people here have argued, they sort of fail to address the material underpinnings, right? Taking children's work as a classic example, rather than engaging with sort of the materiality, the capitalist structuring of poverty and relations of exclusion, expropriation, exploitation, the institutions within this world tend to sort of either sweep that under the carpet or approach it in a very individual fashion. Let's give people sewing machines so that they can individually generate an income. And so what I argue, what again, many of us have argued, is that we sort of miss the wood of well-being for the trees of problematic work or whatever other social problematic the field is choosing to focus on in this particular case, right? Um, I have had conducted research on this in places like Benin, southern Italy, in India. The evidence is pretty clear from my work over 20 years, but again, from the work over many, many years across the world, that this is broadly speaking the state of play. I'm not going to go into why, right? There's a whole bunch of this talk that I'd love to give, but again, I think we broadly speaking agree that there are sort of systems of ignorance that ensure that institutions within this field don't really understand, in inverted commas, what's going on, or if they do understand what's going on, don't do anything about it because it's not in their interests, because donors won't allow it, because of discourses of sort of liberalism ultimately prevent them from really engaging with sort of structural issues and from really leaning into meaningful participation. Because as people like Manfred have shown, participation can be dangerous, right? What do you do if the barbarians at the gates say, let's pull these gates down? I mean, then you make sure the barbarians stay out of the gates. And that's pretty much what the ILO do with working young people, for example. But I'm not going to go into that. What I'm going to talk about much more is what I think we can do about it, right? And I think the sort of fundamental piece, my starting piece, if you will, having spent 10 years sort of diagnosing the ills of this sector, is that we need to very much move away from a politics of rescue, and we need to be moving towards politics and participation. In other words, we need to get structural and get real and get responsive to the sort of material lack that is the condition of poverty and the underbelly of capitalism that we all live under, with differential effects. And we need to genuinely and meaningfully, collaboratively develop solutions to people's problems, whatever they may be, and recognizing that those may challenge us, right? When I did my doctoral work almost 2 decades ago now, 15 years ago now, with teenage boys who were migrating from Benin to Nigeria and were labeled as victims of trafficking, and were sort of rescued or intervened upon in very stereotypical ways. What literally across the board, and I think I interviewed something like 100 odd young people, a bit more, possibly up to 150, pretty much across the board. I mean, like 99% of people said, well, you know, what we could do with, when I asked the question, what would actually help you if village vigilance committees don't help you? People said, money, like just give us some money, and or let's work together to find some solution to whatever our localized problems are, right? So there's my sort of starting point, if you will. And the story that I'm going to give you now is a story of two very large scale pilot projects. And this is sort of why you haven't seen me for a few years, apart from having children and life just being mental. The work that I've been leading over the last couple of years have basically been these large scale pilot projects that sought to do just that, right? To flip the child protection paradigm, the development paradigm more broadly on its head, and sort of address the material lack underpinning people's difficult work, migratory decisions, exploitation, whatever it might be, and to do so collaboratively. In other words, not coming with, well, this is what you need, saying, I haven't got a clue what you need, but what we can do is work together and forge relationships through which emergent responses may manifest themselves. So there are two projects that I'm telling the story of. One, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can, I'm circling Hyderabad in southern India. One took place in Hyderabad and was funded by the European Research Council. One took place in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and remarkably, now it's even more remarkable, was funded by DFID, or what was DFID in the sort of eating of DFID by the Foreign Office in the pre-COVID days. And in both cases, both of these pilot projects, as I say, sort of sought to flip the child protection, the development paradigm on its head. And what they involved were, on the one hand, 350 households, and the other 1,500 households. We worked with 5 entire communities, a very large slum in Dhaka and 4 smaller slums, informal settlements in Hyderabad, Broadly speaking, people were poor, if not very, very poor. And the dominant livelihoods in both cases were sort of classic indecent work according to ILO standards, right? So in India, over half of the people of the households made their living primarily through waste collection, very highly precarized, neoliberalized, sort of semi-informal, quite difficult work. And in Bangladesh, people were engaged in lots of different kinds of work, but work within the sort of lower echelons of the garment supply and leather supply chain was very prominent, right? So very much hard work. Critically, we wanted to, as I say, flip things on their head. So where mainstream interventions are often targeted, one household within a community might be selected according to some external criteria. We worked with every single household, and within that, every single individual across all five of these communities. We wanted to simulate something like universality of response, recognizing the sort of colonial problems of picking and choosing. We also wanted to respond to materiality, right? Poverty. And so that meant giving people cash. And critically, it meant giving people unconditional cash, basic income across an extended period of time. And that was 18 months. The idea being that 18 months is still short, it's still a pilot length of time, but long enough to potentially generate meaningful impacts in people's lives. It goes through multiple sort of cycles, seasons, work trajectories, and therefore, and we know this from sort of parallel pilots in the basic income or the cash transfer universe, is long enough to potentially see plausibly long-term changes take place, even if they may not be sustainable. And alongside the cash, we wanted to offer the sort of inverse of developments, often quite sort of, again, colonial disciplinary approach to social work, and instead have much more bottom-up community organizing, relationship heavy approaches to co-generating responses to people's circumstances, which practically meant sort of retraining a large cadre of social workers in both countries, broadly speaking, to listen and to conduct action research and make relationships with community, go around sort of in social work fashion, sort of with a set of households that it was their job to make relationships with, to conduct extensive needs analyses, and then see what emerges. What do people want to do? The cash was pegged, broadly speaking, in both cases at around 25% of household income, on the logic that it's high enough to make a difference and low enough to potentially be replicable should a state be willing to take it to scale. One caveat in all of this, which is that COVID happened smack in the middle. And so, whereas in India, the cash did last for the initially stipulated 8 months, in Bangladesh, we had to fight to keep the project alive. And so the cash component was reduced to 7 months as opposed to 18, which of course impacted the sort of longevity of findings. The design, very need-centered, very people-led, very emergent. Like, again, I can't emphasize enough how much this was sort of much more of a Freirean approach to community organizing than a traditional development approach to like, let's fix the community. And so it was very need-centered in a quite conscious fashion. We sort of trained people in like Schumacherian nonviolent communication understandings of sort of humans as needing beings, and then relational tools for holding space, for connecting, and for facilitating change. And the layers of engagement that this army of social workers in both cases worked on was very much individual, responding to individual requests for support, a lot of household level stuff, mediation, livelihood planning, and then group work, supporting collective action basically to take place where there was energy for that to happen. The core principles, and I won't labor this point, were very much unconditionality and universality, recognizing that child protection and development, of which child protection, let's say, is a subset, is typically targeted and conditional in ways that many of us know to be deleterious. We flipped it on its head, no behavioral requirements whatsoever. And within the overall target communities, which were, I think, approximately about 8,000 people, no targeting. So everybody was eligible. I am going to speed through. I'm not going to bang on about the research. So I give this talk quite a lot, even to non-researchers or versions of this talk. I recently gave it to, shockingly, the Department of Work and Pensions here in the UK, which you'd think is a super conservative institution. And I thought I was like, Luke Skywalker going to the Death Star, but it was nothing like that. They were massively cool and super nice. But the reason I say that is I typically don't go into the researchy bit. I recognize that a lot of you are researchers, and so I can, but I won't because of time doesn't allow. What I will say is that basically we did a shitload of research across quite a long period of time using lots and lots of different methods. In both countries, broadly speaking, this is what it looked like. The research period covered actually probably about 2.5 years. We had multiple rounds of survey tracking sort of trend changes in health, well-being, freedom, what people did with their time, what work they did, what they spent their money on, schooling, the sort of what you would expect when looking at well-being more broadly. And we did a lot of various kinds of qualitative research. PhD students, one of which at least I believe is here, hello Claire, did lots and lots of extended ethnography. And so this was quite rare for a cash transfer, social protection type intervention, because typically ethnography is not a component of the research around that stuff. We did lots and lots of qualitative subsamples, individual interviews, household level interviews, and our community organizers wrote regular sort of diaries, if you will, documenting their experience and what they considered to have happened. So that's the sort of research piece. It was pretty comprehensive. Summary of the key impacts. I mean, these are the domains according to which we sought to track impact and according to which we did, broadly speaking, in both projects, find quite meaningful impacts. So what were they? I'm speeding. I know I've got 8 minutes. Unsurprisingly, these are graphs from Bangladesh. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that there's a jump between round 7 and round 8. I often ask my students when they're awake, what might have happened between round 7 and round 8? And mostly they're not awake, and so they can't say, but you experienced scholars will know that's when the cash started, right? So predictably, an injection of 25% of household income has a corresponding effect. And we saw this sustained across the life of the intervention. So poverty likelihood decreased, household incomes increased. This is super meaningful in social worlds where people really were living on the breadline. There's lots of data I could share about how people experience their poverty and their sort of coping strategies, but I won't go into too much detail. What I will say is that predictably, what we found again across both countries was that people had alternative coping strategies, where previously many would have taken kids out of school, fewer did so. Where previously people took on very sort of steep repayment rate loans, they were able to pay off those loans and sort of diversify their borrowing, or they were able to simply lean into the extra money they had as opposed to selling off assets. So there was a reduction in debt, and there was an increase, obviously, also in savings. What this tells us, and there's more data that we can pull out later, is that whilst it's very difficult to make the claim this intervention leads to a drop in exploitative work, what we do very much know, following sort of like evaluation language, is that this intervention acted on the causes of vulnerability. What theory tells us and what evidence tells us are the causes of vulnerability to exploitative work, right? So an intermediate effect. We also saw, obviously, lots of investment, right? Again, not surprising. This is all as one would expect, but within our industry or within development and child protection more broadly, it rarely gets translated into intervention. People bought rickshaws, they bought bikes, they bought motorbikes so that they could become couriers. One of my favorite stories from both countries was a woman called Shoba, who is a single mother whose partner killed themselves actually at the start of the project, no less, bought a washing machine and a TV. The kind of intervention that your traditional economist might, I know, Deborah, you're not one of those, but some of the traditional economists are out there, might think, oh, what a profligate investment. But as anyone who, looks after themselves or has had children knows, having a washing machine is a godsend, and having a TV can be as well, right? This was a sort of dignity enhancing, time creating kind of investment that was quite common across both cases, as was, buying fridges and wardrobes and the like, right? Food security improved. These are data from India, and we saw in India a 10% reduction in households selling assets to finance health shocks. We also saw a 26% reduction in households reporting food insufficiency. So these are not insignificant numbers. And if your sort of standard child protection intervention had numbers like that, they'd probably be absolutely thrilled and laughing all the way to the donor. Increases of inabilities to complete protein cycles, and then a lot of sort of improved food. One of the common stories, particularly in Bangladesh, was we can eat meat now at Eid, which we couldn't previously. So there, of course, to that there are both health and kind of cultural well-being implications. Again, particularly given the sort of common misperception and bias, if you like, within policymakers that assumed that poor people are dumb and they will waste money, basically, what we found was that the most important effects of the cash were improved nutrition, improved health, and improved quality of education. entirely intuitive if you've either been poor or worked with poor people, but not so much if you are within a policy-making institution, and therefore worthwhile underlining. This chart shows from Bangladesh various of the sort of impacts or reported impacts. This is self-reported data that was collected every 2 months by the community mobilizers on their household rounds. And you see, huge jumps at the start of the cash, which is sustained in regard to things like I can cope with sudden changes or stress or shocks. We can earn enough money, right? So I'm not a numbers person, as those of you who know me know, but I still find these quite emotional pieces because I know some of the people who are these statistics, but it also bespeaks quite a powerful change in what lives that are really quite vulnerable. I won't go with that. Dignity. For me, emotively, what was like knockout of the park exciting was very much this sense across all of the communities that we worked with that this was a hugely dignifying approach to offering social support, right? People massively appreciated the unconditionality because that respected their autonomy, it respected their agency, it respected their wisdom. People, by virtue of having a little bit more money, were able to negotiate stigma and shame. One grandma in India who made her money seeking alms at the mosque continued to do that and then used her money to buy sweets for her grandkids. And that made her feel awesome because she was able to live up to the role of a grandma. Previously, she couldn't, right? Again, hugely meaningful and the kind of indicators that are not commonly found within sort of stories of development impact, but are really, really bloody important if you have a heart and are a human being, right? Within this, I really want to emphasize the importance of the money itself. And what we found, I can talk about this more in a moment, but what we found was money not only obviously alleviated material pain points, but it also had a quite important symbolic value. Essentially, there's a difference between respecting someone, they're poor, you're rich, you look into each other's eyes, and there's a moment of connection. That's valuable and dignifying, and less dignifying than you recognize that I'm actually really poor and there's money coming alongside, right? So the responding to material lack with material resources very much came out as a sort of a dignity enhancing component of the intervention. Very rapidly now, because I'm at 23 and I'll try to stop at 25, we didn't find a massive impact on labour, which I think is unsurprising given the time-bound nature of the intervention and the social relations of labour. 88% of households in India didn't change their work, for example. But what we did find was lots of subtle changes and lots of the qualitative data, in particular from Bangladesh, told us stories of change, right? Many, many stories of young people going back to school, of kids who are working in factories, starting working in a shop instead of a factory and doing some part-time study, of more household work taking place, right? So there's lots of qualitative evidence of the sort of the worst of the worst reducing. And what we also found at sort of a larger numerical level was a reduction in working time. So in India, at the start, the majority of our participants worked 7 days a week. And halfway through the trial, so when people still had 9 months of cash transfers left, that had dropped by about 40% to people working 6 days a week. So a really quite meaningful expansion of people's freedom. Recognize that it's constrained, as it is in capitalism, particularly at the margins, but nevertheless quite substantial. Rapidly moving on now, I just want to underline one final piece and then I will stop. This was a two-pronged intervention. There was cash and there was community work. What we found very clearly was that there was an important synergy between these two. To some extent, one of our community organizers in Bangladesh said the cash ignited the community organizing, and similar quotes came from India as well. To some extent, the factor of there being this sort of material and relational response kind of enhanced the trust that was developable between the organizers and the community, and therefore enhanced sort of willingness to collaborate on whatever responsive solutions there might be, right? And that also translated into a reported improvement in community relationships. An example of the kind of community responsive activities that all of this facilitated were it was super varied, right? So we saw people ask for trainings in income generation activities. We saw kids asking for sports competitions. We saw lots and lots of people complaining about healthcare. And so the community organizers in Dhaka partnered with a local organization and then ran monthly health camps, which hundreds and hundreds of people who previously couldn't really access professional healthcare were able to access for essentially nothing, right? There were youth activities. And then, really excitingly, in India, what is essentially, and in fact now I think is officially, a union of garbage collectors was set up, right? I couldn't claim to you, and I won't, that that is a result of the cash or a result of the community organizing. If we're being honest in terms of its sort of evaluation language, what we can meaningfully say is that both interventions and the interaction between them contributed in quite important ways to this happening. Put it this way, I don't think it would have happened absent those two pieces, and there's lots of qualitative evidence that suggests as much, that we certainly need to unpick a little bit more of the causal pathways. So basically, to wrap it up, the sort of key findings: cash, as you may expect, is a useful form of social protection that does seem to improve lives, increase well-being, and act on the sort of the intermediate causes of difficult work that typically our industry seeks to just ban. Secondly, this approach to community organizing actually often itself serves as a kind of social protection through, for example, connecting people to services or responsively generating interventions that actually listen to people's needs. Unconditionality is, through its very nature, likely or more likely, certainly our evidence suggests, to lead to a more appropriate and effective responses, precisely by letting go of the log frame that says this is what we have to do and listening to what people want to be done. We find in our intervention much more likelihood that people will actually receive interventions that are useful. And finally, there are these meaningful and productive synergies between the cash and the sort of relational approach, which suggests to me at least, though as I say, I need to do a lot more analysis on the data that we've got, that this combination of cash and community organizing relational work is likely to be more powerful than either intervention alone, both of which put me very much on the train of, I think we really need to be advocating for basic income everywhere, and certainly as a sort of poverty alleviation tool. And we need to be leaning much more heavily into the sort of Freirean-inspired bottom-up action research approach to generating kind of human-centered interventions that don't typically characterize the development and certainly not the child protection field. That's it. Stop.